Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Campus Policing, an event presented by KQED and the CalMatters College Journalism Network. I'm Omar Rashad, a student at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and a reporting fellow with the CalMatters College Journalism Network, a collaboration between CalMatters and student journalists from across California. Tonight, we'll be digging into the debate over whether armed police forces are necessary at California colleges and universities, and if so, what can be done so that students, especially students of color, feel safe on campus. When CalMatters first began discussing this event last summer, it was just after the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, touching off nationwide protests over racism and police brutality. And just recently, the police shooting of Daunte Wright, along with the guilty verdict yesterday in Chauvin's trial, brought home the urgency of the issue of police accountability, particularly in communities of color. At the University of California and California State University, student activists are calling to abolish or reshape campus police departments. And the Peralta Community College District in the Bay Area has replaced sheriff's deputies with unarmed security guards on campus. Meanwhile, administrators and police chiefs are hosting community forums and considering changes to their campus safety plans. Our goal today is to bring together some of these perspectives for a focused discussion on what the future of campus policing might look like. With me tonight is my co-moderator, Felicia Mello, the editor of the College Journalism Network.
Thanks, Omar. As we're getting going here, we'll have a poll up on the screen for our audience. We want to hear what you think. Do you think yesterday's guilty verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial will have an impact on the debate around campus policing? You can go ahead and answer that question as we move forward. We have a diverse and distinguished group of panelists tonight, and we're so grateful they can be here with us. I'm going to begin by introducing each panelist and asking them to each give a 1-minute summary of their vision for the future of campus policing. We'll then move into questions for the panel. Those will be broken into 3 segments that focus on the challenges and the concerns that have emerged in the debate over campus policing, proposals for change, and finally, ways that some campuses are already changing their approach to campus safety. If you have a question for our panel, please put it in the chat. And because we also have a pretty large panel with us tonight, I will ask panelists to keep their comments brief so we can keep the discussion moving. I also want to shout out College Journalism Network fellow Catherine Swartz. She's live tweeting this event for us, and you can follow along at College Beat CA. Our first panelist is Jacory Bowens. He's the Ethnic Studies Student Representative for the Associated Students of San Francisco State University. Last year, he co-authored a student government resolution calling for the abolition of San Francisco State's police department. Jacory, welcome.
Thank you, Felicia. As Felicia was saying, I believe the future of campus policing lies in the eventual pathway for abolition of UPD. Time after time, we've seen that university police departments or police departments in general have tried to be reformed, but you cannot reform a system that's inherently anti-Black and based in white supremacy. A lot of people point to Obama's 21st century policing task force, but that has done nothing. These instances are still occurring. We need to be reinvesting into our community, student programs, mental health resources, decriminalization of homelessness, and so much more. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacory. Next, we have Joseph Farrow. He's the Chief of Police at the University of California at Davis and the former Commissioner of the California Highway Patrol. Welcome, Chief Farrow. Chief Farrow, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. Good evening, everyone, to my colleagues and viewers. Sorry for muting there, but campus safety to me is all about the creation of an environment that allows the university to fulfill its mission of research, learning, and discovery, and at our medical centers, medical advances and treatment. And our safety culture has to promote this mission so people remain safe, and more importantly, that they feel safe, so they're able to experience everything that our universities have to offer. Everything we do should support the mission, and nothing should be in place to detract, impede, or prevent our community members from these experiences. Thus, policing on our campuses, both academic and health, should not serve in isolation or in a silo, but rather should work in harmony with campus partners. I'd also like to add that I do not believe that our students in our community need to be policed, or perhaps more importantly, feel that they are policed. However, I do believe that they need the services and the security that our police departments provide. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Farrow. Kimberly King is an instructor of psychology at Laney College, where she helped lead the campaign to transition the campus to an unarmed security model. Dr. King, welcome.
Thank you. College campuses in the future will be social and racial justice institutions committed to educating all students. They will take a holistic and restorative justice approach to public safety and wellness that includes no police or armed security, but plenty of access to mental health services, mediation, de-escalation, and basic student needs, including housing. Many in the campus community will be trained in culturally relevant, anti-oppressive, restorative justice approaches and mental health first aid so that students, faculty, and staff can work together to build community and keep us safe, provide a positive learning environment for our students who in Peralta are overwhelmingly students of color from low-income backgrounds and who have had traumatic experiences with law enforcement in their communities. The campus will support students by meeting basic needs like housing, food, and in today's online environment, computers and internet service to ensure they can be successful college students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. John Pettis is the chair of the University of California Board of Regents and the former Speaker of the California Assembly. Welcome, Chair Pettis.
Thanks for having me. And thanks for having this conversation. This is exactly what we need to be doing on a broader basis. Last year, immediately following the killing of George Floyd, I called on the University of California to go through exactly this kind of conversation so that we could figure out collectively where we land on the issue of the structural changes that we need to make. It's important for us to have a change in policy, but it's more important to us to have a fundamental change in culture, in the way we look at safety and the way we look at policing, not only on college campuses, but in our communities as well. If we only isolate the question to college campuses, when there's an incident that rises to the level of needing police intervention, if we're just depending on outside police forces to come in, I actually think it's a much more difficult situation than having a security and safety apparatus and culture on a campus that really is rooted in the reality of the campus space.
Thank you, Chair Pettis. Dylan Rodriguez is a professor of media and cultural studies at UC Riverside. He's researched and written widely about abolition movements both on and off campus. Professor Rodriguez, welcome.
Thanks for inviting me. I want to start by saying how much I appreciate that this discussion is actually posing the question of whether there should be a police presence on our campuses. We're in a historical moment that demands fundamental responses to fundamental problems. To cite Regent Perez's comments just now, cultural change, in my view, it means infrastructural change. What we do not need is another round of adjustment and reform to an infrastructure of campus security that creates, contributes to, and reinforces insecurity, including food, housing, and health insecurity. We also do not need an institutional notion of safety that relies on endangerment. And by this, I mean the asymmetrical, targeted bodily, psychological endangerment that is inherent to a police presence. And some of us here have the scars to prove it. So I want to say I'm speaking from 25 years of experience in the UC system. I'm in deep community with students, faculty, staff, community members who regularly encounter police power of the University of California as a targeting and profiling power, as a force of normalized anti-Blackness, as a constant threat to disabled and undocumented people, as a normalized threat to formerly incarcerated people who study and work on and near our campuses, and as an institutional presence that signifies the worst of the UC's history. So I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Professor Rodriguez. Naomi Waters is chair of the Racial Justice Now campaign for the UC Students Association. Naomi, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Again, I'm Naomi Waters. During my tenure of advocacy and research for this position, and ultimately highlight student voices, right? And those voices overwhelmingly call for the defunding and abolition of UCPD. Wanton abuses by law enforcement within the University of California system has yet to be adequately addressed. The UC Police Department has a history, if I can say that this evening, a history of excessive force, brutality, and various forms of harassment. We, the University of California Student Association, condemn these cowardly acts of force and violence. Prior bad acts cannot be remedied with the minimal institutional efforts and post-dated commitments. We demand abolition now. We demand defunding now. Campus safety, partly as we view it, is the creation of a vision around safety that does not require police presence. Students have boldly and amply supplied this to the system. And yes, again, it's in the form of abolition. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. So we want to talk now about some of the concerns that are being raised about campus policing. And Ja'Cory Bowens, I'd like to start with you to get into a little bit more detail. You're a student at San Francisco State. You had an experience where you were stopped on campus and questioned about your right to be there. And I'm wondering if you can share briefly what happened to you and how that drove your advocacy on this issue.
Sure, thank you, Felicia. Yeah, on my campus, I had heard previously of UPD stopping, Black staff members, Black students on campus for simply looking suspicious, but I thought that was like a taboo that wouldn't necessarily happen to me. When I was moving from my dormitory to my next dormitory as an RA, working for the school during the summer, I was followed by parking police. And then when I got to my destination, I was questioned by the contracted security guard saying, "What am I doing?" And I was like, "I work here and I'm moving into my, my space." And then questioned again, being like, "Well, what do you mean?" And, at this point, it was getting, more like confrontational, and I just wanted to leave the situation. And so they were just like, "Oh, well, there's been suspicious people, so I thought I would ask you, or thought I would question you." And that was just very discouraging because one, like I work here, two, even if I was, because it was implied that I was a homeless student, even if I was, that I wasn't doing anything that would require the attention of UPD. And that security agency. So it was just very frustrating having to live through that experience.
Thank you for sharing that. As the College Journalism Network has reported on campus policing this year, we've heard many similar stories from students of color who had similar encounters with police or security on campus and said it really affected their sense of belonging on campus. In a 2019 UC Berkeley poll, only about a third of Black and transgender students said they felt like campus police were looking out for their best interests. In an essay published earlier this year, one of our student reporters, Julian Mendoza, described the experience of being followed half a mile off campus to his neighborhood by several officers after one of them saw him biking on campus and thought he looked suspicious. And he described this kind of disconnect where for the officers, they were making a routine stop to enforce a regulation, but he felt that they didn't understand the fear he experienced as a young Latino man surrounded by cops. And so, I'm wondering, what will it take to end these kinds of interactions between campus police and students of color? Chief Farrow, can it be done without removing a police presence from campus? And if so, how?
Well, thank you for that. And, I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage. I don't really know the incident that was just described, but I will tell you this, I take your word for that. And that simply is wrong. I'll tell you one of the things that we are trying to do in law enforcement is to deal with that issue where people believe that they've been unfairly stopped, unfairly treated as a result of their color and questioned in a very harmful and in a wrong way. And I think you're aware, your viewers may be aware that legislation was passed a couple of years ago that requires all law enforcement agencies now to track and identify all the stops that they make, for what reason, what purpose, what was the outcome of the stop, and it's called the RIPA data. We are now collecting that information, and in fact, we just posted our first year's results. It's on our website at UC Davis to really deal with that issue about who do we stop, for what reason, what was the outcome of the stop, how was it adjudicated, and for what purposes. I think that will help add a little bit of clarity, but I think the point is really well spoken. Is the policing on campus shouldn't be in a way where we are stopping and questioning our students. We're not there to police students. We truly are there for their behalf. I know it's very difficult during these very challenging times for that to resonate with everyone, but that really is our purpose. And so Felicia, as I round that out, whatever we reimagine, whatever we reform, policing should not serve as a silo. They're just part of the campus security mechanism that have a very distinct role. And checking our students to see who belongs and doesn't is not one of them.
Chair Perez, as you mentioned, you recently convened, along with UC President Michael Drake, a symposium on policing at UC. Speaking, I know in your personal capacity, since the regents haven't taken an official position yet, what are the biggest issues with the way UC currently polices its campuses that UC need to be resolved?
So the example you just gave was a Cal State example. but I know it happens on UC campuses as well. I know that it happens as we walk down the street in every community throughout the state. So one of the fundamental changes has to be how we hold law enforcement accountable for those stops that have zero underlying purpose. You've heard me talk about my own experiences, starting at the age of 14 and as recently as right before I went into office, walking home from school as a middle schooler, getting stopped by the police, thrown to the ground, proned out for everybody to see, never being given a reason why I was stopped, and then let go without an explanation, without an apology. A month before I was elected to the legislature, driving through the east side of Los Angeles, stopped in a random broken windows check and being thrown into the back of a police car with handcuffs as a young staff member of mine who was white protested, and I had to tell him to shut up because I thought his protestation would put me in more danger. Taken to the police department, chained to a bench without explanation. And only after I was released was I told that I was taken into custody because there was a warrant out for the arrest of somebody else with my name, who was 5'8" and 150 pounds. And if you know me, I haven't been 5'8" or 150 pounds since I was in junior high. So these are challenges that, yes, do exist on college campuses, but they exist more broadly in society. And so if the only focus of our conversation is doing away with police on college campuses, what happens when somebody calls in to complain? It's exterior police forces coming in and having an even more confrontational experience. Dr. King, I believe, did her undergrad at Yale. And we all saw the case a couple of years ago with an African-American graduate student at Yale in a housing unit, was confronted because another resident of the housing unit called and said she didn't belong there. It wouldn't have been any better if it was the New Haven police as opposed to the Yale police. So it's important for us to have this conversation about how we change the culture on the campus, but we also have to change the culture more broadly about policing in general. We should be at the leading edge of the change. And one of those things is holding accountable law enforcement officers who make discriminatory stops, who confront students for no reason other than suspect identity, because too many of us know that we fall into that category of suspect identity.
And how do we hold those officers accountable, Chair Perez? And is that something the regents will set policy on, or are you leaving it up to the individual campuses?
Well, no, I think we need to set policy on it. Look, I've been struggling with this issue for a lot of years in a lot of capacities. Immediately after the unrest in Los Angeles, after the Rodney King trial and the acquittal of those officers, I went to work helping then Mayor Tom Bradley prepare for the second trial and go back and lay the foundation for rebuilding communities that have been torn apart because of that injustice in policing. Some that were still struggling with issues from years before during the incidents in Watts. Connie Rice, great civil rights attorney, has gone in and done fundamental changes in certain precincts. The idea is you have to change what the expectation of law enforcement officers are. Stop rewarding people for stops, arrests, infractions. Start rewarding people for positive interactions and for disengagement, and actually hold people accountable where it counts against you when you're making these kinds of random interactions that have no basis in response to an actual threat.
One of the other things our reporting has found is that campus police departments at California's public universities are much less ethnically diverse than the student bodies they serve, with less than a quarter of students at our public universities being white. About half of police officers are. Naomi Waters, as a UC student, do you believe it makes a difference whether campus police officers are as diverse as the student body?
Absolutely. Though at the same time, not at all. It's kind of a double-edged sword, right? We want folks to look like us to police us, but do we need to be policed? That's ultimately the question here. I don't necessarily feel any safer with a Black officer than I do with an officer of any other race. The fact still remains that I'm currently in police custody, that I'm essentially being stopped. And just the very instance of that alone, for some can be terrifying.
Yeah, I want to push a little bit more on that question of, you know, when and whether a police presence is necessary. One of the places that we see probably campus police presence the most is at protests. We know just last year at UC Santa Cruz, during graduate student protests, we saw police in riot gear. At least one student filed a lawsuit over injuries that she said she received from officers at that protest. At Chair Perez, at the Regents meetings where you preside, audience members have to go through this gauntlet of police barricades to enter. Is that level of heavy police presence appropriate in cases where students are exercising their First Amendment rights? And I'll toss that to either Chair Perez or Chief Farrow to answer that one.
Do you want me to go first, Chief, or do you want to go first?
Sir, yeah,
Go ahead.
I'll go first. I will tell you this. That's a fundamentally really good question. I can tell you what we put into practice at UC Davis is that we have a protocol, a practice that we put into play in 2017, where we have not had one protest on our campus, and we've had many, where the police were involved. We don't go out to our protests. We're not there out on the line. We allow these activities to go through for the expression of free speech. We're way away from the event there in case we are needed for things, but we don't involve ourselves. It's all run by student affairs. We have other activists that deal with those protests to let them go through. I do know that there have been protests where there are police presence on different campuses for different reasons, for information maybe they had. But I do agree with one thing is on these peaceful protests, there really isn't a need to have a strong police presence unless there's other issues and information they have that there may be some type of counter protest where you need a police presence. And most of us on campus don't fit in that mold. They just don't simply fit into that. So that's what we do at UC Davis.
So, you know, I think the Chief's onto a good start. I try to start myself. When I took over as chair, I did a couple of things. I eliminated the riot gear that police officers are using at Regents meetings. It's preposterous that you step up not only the presence of police officers, but the presentation of police officers in that way. And I cut the budget of policing for those meetings by 50% day one and set us on a continued glide path for reduction thereafter. Why? Yes, there's always a need for safety in some ways, but I think that when you have an excessive presence as we've had, and when you have it represent itself in the way that we have, you actually inflame, you don't invite people in for conversation. And so I think these are exactly the kinds of changes that we need to start talking about. A variety of campuses have different levels of engagement for student protests and for other protests. I think we ought to set a system-wide standard at the end of this conversation. I think that what happened at Santa Cruz was appalling. I think it was appalling. There was no need for that level of police activity. There was no need for the presentation of law enforcement in the way that they presented themselves during the Santa Cruz wildcat strike. There was no need for the campus police to go off campus and engage in policing traffic activity in the city of Santa Cruz. For 15 years before I was in the legislature, I was a labor leader and worked with law enforcement around the state about appropriate engagement of law enforcement in labor disputes. I think we have to completely retrain whatever police force we have in how you look at the best practices from that work that's been done and what you do with student protests. But engagement in the way that we've seen in some of these instances has no place on our college campuses, quite frankly, has no place in civil society.
Dr. King, I'm interested in the community college perspective here. What were some of the concerns that you had and the group that worked with you at Laney as you decided to make this move towards unarmed security on your campus?
Yes, I mean, I really have the question of why do we need police on college campuses? It doesn't make sense to me. And Is it to police protest? Is it to police poor people to decide who's a student and who's not? We don't have we have very little crime on our campuses, really. So I'm not sure exactly what the need is for the police. On our campus, it was very disturbing to see the Alameda County Sheriff have their big SUV sitting there when you walk right into campus. The first thing you see is a big sheriff's SUV. That doesn't feel to me like a college campus. It was not like at Yale where the rich people go. They didn't have big SUVs sitting there saying police department or sheriff's right in front of the students. I co-coordinate a Black Student Success Program called Umoja, and I've had 2 really bad experiences with the sheriffs and my students. One case, the sheriffs decided to give a Black female mother student a $1,000 ticket for littering. Not because it was really a problem, but because she didn't show him, necessary deference, which is what we're seeing in a lot of these things that happen in the real world. Most of us who are involved in abolition and defunding on our campuses are involved in our cities. We are involved in the national movement. This is just where we are right now, and we're on this panel to talk about what we can do on campuses. My student, the sheriff yelled at her on a bullhorn from way down the campus, pick up that off the ground, and she just ignored him, and then he followed her around campus. He went into her math class. Do you know what the challenges these students are already facing? Then to have this experience similar to what Chair Perez knows about from his youth, and almost all of us probably have had, all of us who are people of color. Another time, I was doing a workshop in the Umoja village, and I noticed one of my male students was looking out the window, looking kind of agitated. And I asked him, what's wrong? And he said, there's a policeman out there and it makes me very uncomfortable. So I went outside. So the sheriff was leaning on the banister outside of our building. And I just said, officer, one of my students is traumatized by you. Is there any way you could move to another place so that he can't see you out the window? And he refused. He said, no, he shouldn't be traumatized. How are you going to tell someone they should not be traumatized? He was traumatized. I wouldn't have stopped the workshop and gone outside if he wasn't. That is what police do. They harass, they try to control us. It's not the place. It's not what they should be doing on college campuses or anywhere. We need to defund the police. It's also costs a lot of money to pay police officers. And why do they need guns? It just doesn't make sense to me. We decided to work to use the defund model, which is all that means is to divest in policing and invest in other resources to help students. And we decided to do that after the George Floyd trial not murder, because so many people were kind of the way that it was, the universities seemed to be handling it was to talk and have conversations. Let's talk about race. Let's talk about unconscious bias. And I'm not saying that's not important, but we need to do things. Yes, culture is important, but the way culture changes a lot of times is through policies, laws. You know that, Mr. Perez, from your work as a legislator. It is so important to actually make real changes. And so being the founding place of the Black Panther Party, the Peralta colleges, Huey Newton and Bobby Seals were students there. As you may remember, it was called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. In the 60s, it was started to defend Black people against police violence and police harassment. And so we just felt like we wanted to do something that was going to make a real change in Black and brown and poor students' lives. And so we were able to make this change. And luckily, the district and the Board of Trustees unanimously agreed that we needed to terminate the contract with the Alameda County Sheriffs, and they're gone.
Dr. King, thanks so much. And we're going to return to the details of that later in the program. Before we conclude this section, I wanted to go to Professor Rodriguez quickly because, I think there's been such a flourishing of this debate in the last year since George Floyd. And I think we can sometimes get the impression that this is a new conversation, but it's not necessarily a new conversation. And as Dr. King just pointed out, different campuses are differently policed, and college campuses haven't always had police departments. And I'm wondering, Professor Rodriguez, if you can give us a little bit more context about that.
We have to understand the University of California Police are a relatively recent creation. They were not there at the founding. It's not a coincidence that the UC police that we experience now, that we are terrorized by now, that we bear the scars of now, became what it was shortly after the formal abolition of US apartheid Jim Crow, in the face of university-induced de facto segregation and gentrification. That's when the UC police became the militarized police force that it is now. It also is critical to understand that the police presence in the UC system not only creates this artificial, though very material boundary, almost like a moat, a militarized moat between a public university campus and surrounding poor, unhoused, criminalized Black and brown working class communities. Not only does it do that, but the roots of this modern UC campus police is in the repression of freedom-seeking, liberation-oriented social movements. That's why this turned into what it is. The anti-war movement, the Black freedom struggle, the Third World Liberation Front ethnic studies movement. The roots of the UC police are entangled in the history of repression of these grassroots and campus engaged movements. So the university's strategies of police and administrative repression in that sense are so far on the wrong side of history that it stuns me that we still resist learning from it in 2021, because we're in a historical moment right now. We're speaking to a historical moment right now. We're about 24 hours from the most exceptional verdict in the history of the United States criminal jurisprudence being passed down in Minnesota, right? This is so far exceptional that everybody will remember where they were when that verdict was read. So we are in a historical moment in which this is, it's time to speak back. And I want to actually say that, you heard it here first. The chair of our own UC Regent John Perez, you actually asked an abolitionist question during your comments about 20 minutes ago, I'll say, by asking, how do we create a community on campus, a safe and secure community on campus without the police? I appreciate you raised, that is actually an abolitionist question. And if we take the chair of the Regent's own question seriously, we can actually engage, number one, with the deep crisis of legitimacy that police power has in this historical moment, especially at places, it's been ongoing at places where, places where Chief Farrow is over at UC Davis. I mean, the John Pike pepper spray incident will live on in everyone's minds forever in the UC system. So we're dealing with the crisis of legitimacy of policing. And I think what we need to revisit as far as the infrastructure of policing, we need to revisit this thing called concurrent jurisdiction. A lot of folks out there may not know what that is, but it is an agreement that campuses make with local police departments and sheriff's departments that essentially gives the campus relative autonomy and independence in creating its own campus security infrastructure. There's nothing in it, and let's bring in the experts on this. I think I'm sort of one of them, but let's get some other people in here. There's nothing in concurrent jurisdiction that prevents us from creating, inventing a feasible, viable abolitionist alternatives to a campus police presence. So that's the second thing I'll say. The last thing I'll say, while we're saying all of this, there is, as we speak, under review, a set of system-wide UC police reforms, policy reforms that are under engagement right now, that are being discussed in the academic senate and faculty circles right now. And I gotta tell you how appalled, alarmed, and disgusted I am that one of the things that's been proposed is this thing called a system-wide response team for the UCPD. It's essentially designed to facilitate multi-campus police mobilizations analogous to a National Guard, which transparently is there to control and suppress mass demonstrations on and near UC campuses, especially when they involve the presence of UC regents, perhaps the ambassadors of nations that people want to hold accountable for apartheid policies and genocidal human rights violations, for example, Israel's treatment of Palestinians. Part of this new proposed policy for creating this system-wide response team, this SRT, it actually uses the language of meeting operational needs by including personnel, including what's called a grenadier. I had to go back and fact check what a grenadier is. According to the US Army Field Manual, a grenadier is a soldier that, as you might expect, has a grenade launcher. According to the University of Wisconsin, in their police policy, grenadier refers to an officer who's been trained in the use of chemical agents and munitions and their delivery systems. So we're saying all this in this discussion right here at the very same time that the system administration is considering policies to create, a hyper-militarized additional, collaboration among its police forces that are entirely there to control people, to police people, and to deploy them in these really dynamic and horrific ways. I could say a lot more about that. I'm gonna shut up now.
Thank you, Professor Rodriguez. I see a lot of folks in the chat asking to hear more from the students on the panel. We hear you. We're going to move to a new segment talking about some of the proposals for change that students and faculty are putting forward. And to do that, I'm going to turn it back over to my co-moderator, Omar. And I believe we also should have some of the results from the polls up on the screen if we want to share that while we're doing. So this is interesting. So we've asked what best describes your views on campus policing. Looks like 30% of our audience thinks campus police departments should be abolished. 45% think they should be maintained, but with significant reforms to ensure all students feel safe on campus. And 25% say that campus police departments are effectively keeping our universities safe and only minor changes are needed. And it looks like it's about split between folks who feel like the concerns students and faculty are raising about campus policing are being heard and those who do not. Let's move on now. I'm going to turn this over to Omar and we'll talk more about some of the solutions that are being proposed.
Thanks, Felicia. Before we get started on this segment, we're going to go through another poll. You'll see another poll appear on your screen shortly. Please take a moment to fill that out. Right now, we'll be switching gears to discuss, potential solutions. Reform has been a big topic, and the dialogue right now is what is the best way to move forward? All right. Recently, the UC Student Association put forward a very specific set of proposals around campus policing. Naomi, when you introduced some of those proposals at a symposium last month, you said campus safety is about more than just policing. You also mentioned that during your introduction today. Can you please explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So for UCSA, some of the goals and stances that we've taken are specifically in the vein of transparency and community-led accountability. So first, the disarmament of at least 40% of officers on duty should not be armed. And thus, due to the many non-violent interactions they have with students, the reduction of manumission and militarization, outcome tracking for UQs or the UC undergraduate experience surveys, right? Also, as well as grievance supporting, creating a public system-wide dashboard for tracking police actions disaggregated by demographics, specifically by race, hiring freezes, budget, departmental line item disclosures, reallocation of funds for students, more importantly, that are consistent of more the aims that the university purports that they have, but not limited to, CAPS, counseling and psychological services, which are drastically understaffed and underfunded, housing for houseless students or developing housing for housing insecure students, system impacted folks as well, and foster youth. And I guess secondly, to tie into that, developing pilot programs for restorative justice initiatives at campuses to reimagine justice within the academic community, which also means the recruitment, the hiring and training of restorative justice professionals and practitioners who can make impacts in the community within and outside the UC system.
Got it. Yeah. And can you talk a little bit more about how campus safety expands to not only the well-being of students, but housing, food, and various other basic needs? I think that's another thing that UCSA has brought forth.
Absolutely. And so to bring light to Jacori's experience specifically, that is something that continuously happens throughout the UC and the CSU as well. Folks of color are routinely policed for not meeting the criteria, or whatever that is, set forth by agents of the institution, specifically officers, of maybe you're houseless or possibly system impacted in any capacity, right? To assist in students, to readily assist students with those specific needs, we would like to defund the police and reallocate those funds. We definitely believe that it's not necessarily a fix-all for what's going on in our campuses, but it is certainly a start. And just a little bit, so UCSA supports in the following legislative recommendations. So like AB 48, the ban of kinetic energy and chemical weapons on protesters, right? And AB 26, that's just been introduced, supports officers to report instances of use of force and departmental abuse without whistleblower mandates. But as Dr. Rodriguez just announced, with the addition of the Gold Book implementations, it reinforces the regressive tactics that the members of the legislature seek to remove from forms of policing inside and outside our campuses. And quite honestly, personally, I find this a bit terrifying, as we all saw the Chauvin verdict come down, and they used, I just got news of this happening today, the implementations, the institutions, this institution reasserts its values to social justice and racial equity, while having these guidelines that the institutions are more dexterous in their imagination, right? In the forms of these Gold Book updates on policing, specifically within this imagination, the definition of active resistance. What is that? It's defined currently now in these recommendations as the body tensing up. But I think if you're under some sort of duress, certainly your body would tense up. So it's quite interesting, personally being in the room when we're talking about the symposium planning. This is not something that I specifically had in mind. I personally thought of these policies should not be enacted, especially as UCOP has enlisted the labor of students to help guide these processes. It not only undermines these efforts, but also pollutes further dialogue. So certainly neither system, right, University Office of the President or the Regents are not without their faults, but the onus directly falls heavily on the Office of the President.
Got it. Thank you, Naomi. Chair Perez, just very notable, the UCSA has demanded a hiring freeze and a 40% reduction in the number of armed sworn officers at UCs. Is that something you or your fellow regents would support?
I don't speak for the regents, right? And let's be very clear. By law, we're not allowed to speak to each other outside of meetings individually to create a serial meeting, so I can't speak for others. I absolutely think that a significant reduction, whether it's 40% or 33%, or I think there's room to have a discussion about a significant reduction in policing on campuses, significant. And I don't think the 40% number is wildly out of the range of possibility. I do want to say this. The other issues that Naomi raises in terms of basic needs being met, support services for students, psychological counseling, those are all really important as well. And we shouldn't limit the scope of the growth in those to the reduction in policing, because I think we need to do that in a number that can benefit from the savings and the reduction in policing, but far exceeds that. And we can't slow down the pace of trying to address that. And I think in the next year, you're going to see some significant movement, especially in the area of mental health services and the priority that the president and I put in that area. So I actually think that the UCSA recommendations are really well reasoned and lay a very good foundation for the discussion that we should be having. But if I may, I want to respond to something that was raised before about why we need police on campuses. And I'm going to say something unpopular. One of the reasons we need police on campuses is because campuses are not free from violent crime, and they're not free from other expressions of crime that are appropriately responded to by police. I'll give you two examples just this week on one campus. Some of the other campuses don't send me the daily newspapers online, but the Berkeley paper I read every day. There was a robbery at the International House that was significant this week. There was a strong arm robbery of a student coming out of Echeverry Hall on the Berkeley campus, where a young woman was assaulted and had her computer taken away from her. Those were appropriate places for police response. We have violent attacks and sexual attacks that happen on campuses just like they happen in other areas of the community. Those are appropriate places for police response. And so this is why I haven't embraced the term abolition. Well, I embrace a lot of the concepts that underpin the conversations that have led to that. we don't have any space that's free of crime that victimizes people, one. Two, if we don't have a campus-based police system, and Professor Rodriguez talked about concurrent jurisdiction, then the response is from a non-campus-based police force, which I think is inherently more problematic. Third, if we have no police anywhere, we revert to the times where we had no organized police forces, where we had mob rule, where we had vigilante justice, and where we had even greater number of lynchings than we see in the environment of policing. So the question is, how do you scale appropriately? How do you focus appropriately? And Dr. King referenced legislation, and Naomi Waters referenced legislation, all very good. But legislation without a fundamental cultural shift is not going to be enough. And part of that cultural shift has to be accountability. Yesterday's ruling in the Chauvin case wasn't justice, it was accountability. Justice would be George Floyd not being murdered by the police officer. Accountability is holding Chauvin partially responsible, as much as the law allows, for his illegal, horrific act. So we've got to step up accountability at every step of the way.
I want to give the opportunity to Ja'Cory to respond to a couple of those comments. Ja'Cory.
Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak. Before I begin, I'm hoping that there's more opportunities for students to speak, specifically me and Naomi. We are Black, we are students. I've only spoken once. And so in my, before I even begin, I feel like it's important to understand that, like, when we're talking about policing and why policing is here, it's there to secure secure the institution, not for the protection of students. Specifically in the Cal State system, it was created in 1975 in response to the ethnic studies protests, where SFPD brutalized SS State students and like beat them. And instead of like providing resources, we got a UPD. And so when we're talking about like, oh, UPD's on here campus to protect, that's not the case in San Francisco State. That's not the case for the CSU wide. They were here to secure the assets of the CSU system, as well as the campus community. And moreover, I'm hearing a lot of people say, in terms of like safety, but it's very clear that safety is subjective. And I hope that we're not like saying that because people feel safe because of having police, other people's safety and concerns is not as valid. And ultimately, police do not deter crime. Crime will still occur. We need to address the resources that are preventing these, that are making these things happen. Police are not about to like come in and stop it. We need to be investing within the community. And it's so amazing hearing all the work that Naomi, that you have done with the UC Student Association, because I feel like within California State and within the CSUs, it's very hard for us to be able to have our voice heard and be able to be platforms to be able to get this accomplished. Yeah, and so just going off with this conversation in terms of like, where do I see with the need of police on campus, or is there a need of police on campus? The simple answer is no. No matter how much you diversify the police, there's a Black chief of police at San Francisco State. I was still racially profiled and nothing happened. Like, those are very non-valuable solutions. At the end of the day, like, okay, diversity is great, but that is not solving the root at hand. The issue at hand. And so, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, and just to follow on that, you were mentioning earlier how abolition is the answer, and can you just talk a little bit more into sort of like why is that, a topic, a stance that many student activists, many student leaders are putting the flag in the ground and standing behind? Yeah.
Okay, so I believe abolition is the answer, because I always ask people, like, how do you reform something that was based off like slave patrols, white supremacy? How do you reform, like, how is that something that is reformed or redeemable? And I say that, abolition is the answer, because at the end of the day, okay, you take away weapons from UPD, you defund them, police are still there, Black students are still not feeling safe, other students are still not feeling safe, and people always bring up, for instance, like, well, what happens in a school shooting? the school shooting is not being deterred by UPD being on campus. In fact, in my instance on campus, when there have been alerts or scares, UPD has not responded in the way that they even needed to make us feel quote unquote safe. Once again, suggesting that it is subjective, this feeling of feeling safe, when reality, it's not getting rid of the issue. These issues are still occurring. And so with abolition, we have the opportunity to redefine what a safe campus looks like in the future, with investing into housing, providing basic needs, investing into CAPS on our campus, investing into the Student Health Center, providing resources for domestic violence. All that stuff is stuff that we could be doing, but we're not, because we're so focused and fixated on the role of UPD on our campus, when there was a time when UPD was not on our campus, but people cannot seem to remember when there was no police forces on college campuses.
Thank you, Ja'Cory. I guess, just pulling on this thread of abolition, Dr. Rodriguez, can you explain like what abolishing police on university campuses might look like in reality? Like what would happen? What would replace them? Yeah.
First of all, I want to say how much I appreciate Ja'Cory and Naomi being here, and I'm here to have y'all's back. That's my main function here. So I'm really appreciating just taking in what you're saying. So I'm going to respond to your question, Omar, as somebody who's been involved in abolitionist struggle for almost 25 years, since before the term was legible to most people, since before it was cool to call oneself an abolitionist. And I'll say that first thing we got to get out of our heads is this idea that abolition is some kind of destination point that you reach and then it's just over, right? It's no different than other forms of liberation, where it's a constant practice. It's a form of analysis. It's a method of creating community. And for this conversation, it's a method of creating security and safety. So concrete answer to your question, Omar, I'll say this: we call ourselves a public university, right? And yet the way we police our university polices it as if it is some kind of damn colony. All right, like we in many geographies, not just in the UC system, but all over the country, public universities create an absolute militarized boundary between the campus and the surrounding communities, especially when the surrounding communities are full of unhoused people, disabled people, displaced people, undocumented people, formerly incarcerated people, criminalized people, Black people, poor working class people, et cetera. All right, so we got to understand that we need to take back the idea, an abolitionist idea of public in the public university. What that means, in my view, is that you have to radically rethink and rigorously rethink a redistribution of the university's resources and infrastructure so it actually serves the surrounding public, right? Meaning those very communities that I just mentioned. That, by the way, that's going to stop a lot of damn crime. What we're calling crime, property crime, interpersonal crime, exploitation, harassment. If universities were actually public and accountable to the public, and we're doing things like organizing free public access to otherwise privatized and inaccessible university resources like classes, libraries, performance space, computer labs. If universities did that, you are going to create a level of engagement and trust and community, real community with the surrounding community that is going to radically reduce interpersonal crime and exploitation. If you take the university's resources and redistribute and restructure them so that you are expanding free and or progressively subsidized health services for people on and near campuses who are suffering from profound levels of health insecurity, because this is, after all, the United States of America, which is got the most atrocious degrees of health insecurity of any so-called developed, overdeveloped first world nation. If universities led that way, now you're going to get rid of you're actually going to prevent a lot of what ends up being interpersonal violence that comes oftentimes as a result of different forms of insecurity, including health insecurity. If you have university-supported food and housing resources, including emergency housing, accessible campus and campus-supported food security, like farming, healthy food pantries. I'm saying all of these are infrastructures that we can do right now. This is all abolition. These are all abolitionist measures of creating secure campuses, safe campuses. And not only do they not require police force, they actually do the opposite. They do the opposite of what a police presence does. They induce a sense of freedom, of autonomy, of accountability to each other, especially if we take an abolitionist notion of the public in the public university seriously. So that's the start of an answer, and I could go on and on about it, but I think it requires some collective discussion among a bunch of us.
Got it. Thank you. We've been talking about armed police on these campuses, but in our reporting with the College Journalism Network, we've also learned that many colleges actually do not have police departments. The Claremont colleges, for example, a consortium of private colleges in Southern California, has more than 8,000 students but uses unarmed security guards for campus safety. So does New York University and public universities in Canada. They rely on local police departments instead. There's a thread of this conversation that will be discussed in the next segment. And we're looking forward to Dr. King talking about that. But before we do that, I'll turn it over back to Felicia.
Thanks, Omar. Yeah, just to kind of push a little bit on what Omar was just starting to discuss about, colleges and universities that don't have their own police departments. And I know, Chair Perez, you raised some reasons why, there specific types of crimes, require an on-campus police response. We had an audience member who raised the issue of the killings in Santa Barbara near the campus there, and how they felt it was pretty important to have a police presence when something like that is happening. And Chief Farrow, I'm wondering if you could explain. I feel like we have this discussion a lot about why it's important to have a police department that understands the situation on a local campus and familiar with it. And we talk about it a lot in the abstract, but I'm wondering, Chief Farrow, if you could share a specific example of, when it made a difference to have an in-house police department at UC Davis versus relying on local police the way some of these other universities who don't have police departments do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I think the most important thing I could say right now is, unfortunately, crime does occur on our campuses. It does every single day. You may not see it, you may not be aware of it. It occurs every single day. We have students who are victimized. We have students that are assaulted. We have people that are strong armed robberies. We have carjackings. It happens every day. Our system is enormous. We have millions of square foot of land mass. We have billions of dollars of infrastructure. We have hundreds of thousands of people who come to our campus every single day, and sadly, some of them are victimized. And by having a police department that can train and be there and respond, I think is really, really imperative to be able to have that. But also one thing I did want to say too, and this is where it gets confused sometimes, is that maybe in policing, we haven't always done the best job articulating the need. But because one of the things that we talked about for just a few minutes, and Professor Rodriguez, I understand the concern about having this document go through the system that was being done on what they call SRT. Those are response teams to large protests and large gatherings where they start to be clash and there's going to be issues. That document is 5 years old, started in 2016. It was a part of the university report on how the university could police itself without having to use mutual aid, without having to bring other people on the campus, and how the university could train itself. The document, the timing, I'll admit, the timing's bad.
I'm well aware. I reviewed it. I was chaired by Academic Senate, so I'm well aware of the history of the document. I'm saying it's under review with a bunch of reforms now, and I think it's garbage. I think it's really reprehensible what's in it.
If I could finish, the timing of it going into the gold book is probably bad, but it is the operating document that all the institutions are using right now. But I think my point for all of that is how that's explained, how that's introduced to the communities and stuff is lacking. And Naomi, I tell you, I loved where you were going in your dialogue, because a lot of things that you presented, we're trying to do, we are doing them today, and we're trying to get that out there. I don't think we've always done the greatest job on allowing our communities to understand that, but we are trying to move in that direction. So we could spend a lot of time on that. I could go through list after list after list of some of these programs that we have. But at the very end of the day, I think there is a need to have policing on our campuses. I understand both sides, but this discussion is healthy. And I think we have to continue this discussion, because hopefully maybe we all learn from these discussions.
So this segment is about concrete steps that campuses are taking. While we're on you right now, Chief Farrow, I'm wondering if you can just explain what UC Davis is doing to respond to some types of cases, some types of incidents with unarmed officers rather than sworn armed officers.
Well, I can tell you this, in the traditional sense of police officers doing police work, all of my officers are armed. I do not send police officers out to do police work unarmed. But in these discussions, we've learned that not everything that our police officers do requires an armed response. There are issues that come up, and I think that's been really well established with all of our panels today. Some of the things and functions we do not require police responses. And I think that's really what we're looking at. We're looking at how do we bring about these tiered systems where you don't have to have a uniformed police officer with a weapon. Maybe you can replace that with our student security. Maybe you replace that with professional security. In our campuses, we do have officers that go out and they teach and they interact with students and they go out on the campus and they may or may not be armed, but they're certainly not in full uniform. They don't have a weapon that is displayed. They more mesh with really the greater community. And those are things that we're experiencing. So what we're trying to do, and I think all the universities are trying to do, is figure out a way to deploy and to secure the campus in a way that is least intrusive to our students, but also recognizing at the same time the triggering effect, the life experience a lot of our students have. And I think that's where we're working towards, is a more tiered approach rather than a reliance fully on armed police officers.
Naomi and Jacory, I'd like to hear from you. Does this kind of tiered approach that Chief Farrow is talking about, making police maybe less visibly armed and uniformed and in some circumstances, does that make a difference for students who might have had traumatic experiences with police?
Would you like to go first, Jacory?
You can go, Naomi. I'll go after you.
Okay, thank you. So currently I'm a student, right, within the UC system at UC Riverside. However, I was previously a student at Humboldt State University. And in 2017, a student by the name of Josiah Lawson was stabbed to death just outside of his campus, well within the 1 mile radius of a UPD's operation, right? Sorry, it's a lot. But instead of giving him potentially life-saving aid, UPD decided to do crowd control against the mainly Black and brown students who circled around their friend hysterical because he was dying. To me, this is indicative of how police and policing works on our campuses. When students of color really need these folks, where are they? And what are they doing? Are they protecting us, or are they assisting in our demise, actually? So I believe that this is something that's absolutely, again, indicative of the state of our campuses and policing on our campuses. As of now, UPD, right, at Humboldt State has not been held rightfully accountable. The CSU has not been held rightfully accountable. And the UC has not learned, I don't think, from this particular instance of abuse. And there's certainly many ills within our own institutions that we can definitely call upon. So just with that, no.
I think that's a great point, Naomi. And when I think about like on my own campus, in terms of like Chief Farrow, you were saying that, it's important for UPD officers to be armed in the situations that they're responding to. But like, I don't necessarily agree with that, because even on my own campus, I've literally seen as an RA, a resident having a mental health issue, literally self-harmed in handcuffs in a patrol car, not going to the ambulance because of like the precautions or the policies in place to handle mental health issues. And like, I just don't think that's necessarily like acceptable for our students. And then even having, ununiformed police officers. As a Black student, that's even scarier to me than seeing, like, not knowing that this person is a police officer and they're doing all this stuff to me. I would be more likely to be fearful for my life because I don't even know who this person is. And so I just think all these recommendations, like, they don't necessarily like solve the issues at hand. And just how you were saying, like, we don't see the car break-ins, or we don't see people getting assaulted, or we don't see all this stuff. This is stuff that could be prevented with resources invested into the community. And UPD is not a force that is equipped to do that. It's a policing institution. And I think that, like, we cannot, like, and that's why I always say, like, we cannot reform an entity that was based to make sure that slaves did not run away, and that transformed and was adopted by the government and to become the policing of what we know today. And so, like, it's hard to, like, as a Black student, to just hear and be like, well, we can rely on reform when reform has failed for every single year in this country. And even with Obama police, the 21st century police force that is adopted by the CSU, According to studies, 40% after 2 years after that was adopted, 40% of police departments across the country had adopted that. But the amount of people who were getting killed by the police, about 1,000 people per year, remains stagnant, the same since 2014. That has not changed. So we are relying on these outdated, no good philosophies to work at a system that's inherently broken. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Corey. We have an example, as we started to touch on earlier, of a community college district that is moving towards unarmed security, has terminated their contract with sheriff's deputies. And I want to return to Dr. King to tell us a little bit more about what does that actually look like now? How does it work?
Well, we have moved to unarmed security. We do not have any armed security. The sheriffs are gone as of December 31st. And we were one of the first to make that decision in the Bay Area. And now we have unarmed security. We have a Marina Security. We have 2 firms and A1 Security, but we're actually working to implement more restorative justice oriented organizations. Community Ready Corps, which is an active organization that's from Oakland. We hope that they're going to be working with us. And another one called Zulu Security. I did want to just say a couple of things about the last incident before I tell you more about the last discussion. I think what Chief Farrell said, the way he stated very matter-of-factly that he doesn't let his police go out without guns, that is the problem. That's what police do. That is policing. Policing uses force and the threat of violence. We don't need that on campus. We do need safety, but there's other ways to implement safety. I don't want police officers doing these programs like they're not trained to do mental health programs. They could be retrained, we could cut the police. They can go into learning how to be a social worker or how to be a therapist. But policing, and as someone else said, we have to remember that police don't usually prevent violence. They come and take a report after the violence has already happened. So all these crimes that are happening, people getting assaulted, did the police stop them? No. So anybody can take a report. I mean, I'm in favor of reports, but I'm not in favor of police with guns. Okay, so what we did was after the George Floyd incident happened, we did a petition drive. We worked with faculty, students, and staff. It worked out because it was summer and it was coronavirus. And so there wasn't, all the opposition wasn't around. So politically, it worked very well to move it through. We're also much smaller than the UCs and the Cal States, so it was easier for us to make that happen. We had a lot of community support. We're Oakland, like I said, the founder of the Black Panther Party, but several organizations that I want to shout out to the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. They really, helped us out, the Anti-Police Terror Project as well. So what we have now, I'm part of a group called Black Minds Matter at Peralta that we founded of students, faculty, and staff and community members. Right now, it's mainly faculty and students still working. We've put together a holistic safety plan that does include these different elements, mental health services. We actually found out that when we did the statistics on how many therapists you should have at a college, we have about 1/3 of the number that we should have. So we are advocating for the hiring of 10 new full-time mental health therapists, a restorative justice training for everyone, a mental health first aid training, which is an 8-hour training that people can get to learn how to de-escalate and how to notice mental health challenges. Let's see, we have student safety aides, and we want to increase their training and the use of student safety aides. We are working to implement, so as I said, we have 2 firms that are working there now who do not have guns, but we are really trying to bring in the more, they're Oakland-based, minority-owned, restorative justice-oriented organizations that are going to be patrolling the campuses, but without guns. They're going to be making relationships with the people on campus, meeting the students, meeting the faculty, developing relationships that will prevent crime from happening, not deal with it just after it happens. We already, Vice Chancellor Siri Brown has already put in place hiring 4 part-time though, mental health crisis counselors. Actually, our title, they involved us in describing the job description, and they're restorative justice interventionists is going to be their title. They're part-time, 1 on each campus. We have 4 campuses. That's not enough. You know, we're advocating for 10 full-time mental health counselors, but this is on the way there. So, and I totally agree with what Chairman Perez said about it shouldn't just be defund and use the money from the police to provide for these needs, because there's not enough money. Yes, we need to defund the police, but we need enough resources to provide housing, to provide mental health services, to provide food for the students in addition to defunding the police. It's going to require extra money. And that's kind of where we are now, that the cost for the new services are pretty much actually more than the cost of the sheriffs. And so now we're trying to really advocate to not just get the non-police patrol there, but to also put the restorative justice training in place, the mental health first aid training, and the other mental health services. And we are advocating for student housing, affordable student housing. And I really love the idea. I don't remember who said it. I think it was Professor Rodriguez, because Laney College is located in downtown Oakland, where there's a lot of homelessness in the area. I mean, throughout Oakland, there's a lot of homelessness now. So dealing with helping the community, not just the people on campus. And with community colleges, there's less of a distinction anyway, but there's a need. Most of our crimes, I mean, I don't know what's going on in the UCs, but we did not have a lot of crimes, at least what is reported to the sheriffs. We had we had very few violent crimes. We had 15 burglaries in the whole year, at least that were reported, and 23 drug abuse arrests. And then the next largest one was liquor related. So these are crimes of poverty, crimes of homelessness, crimes of our society that has abandoned the people. And that's what the divest and about abolition is about, is stop abandoning the people, stop harassing and controlling the police are being used to deal with economic problems that our society has just said, forget it, we're not gonna deal with it. So now they're using police to do it. And so anyway, we have started and we're on our way, and we're lucky that the coronavirus is keeping our campus, you know, there's always a silver lining that there's not a lot of people on campus, so we have more time to develop the new safety plan. One thing I'm very disappointed about with our administration is they are not using shared governance through this process. They are not getting input from the students, from the faculty, and from the staff about how this is going to happen. So we're going to keep pushing. Our group, Black Minds Matter, is going to keep pushing for that. But overall, it's very exciting. It's a new model. And I look forward to working with some of you maybe in trying to help you, and you trying to help us, and how we can move forward with this model. I mean, I also want to encourage Ja'Cory maybe to look into working with the faculty union, the California Faculty Association, because my understanding is that they would be committed to, and that they are committed to getting rid of the police as well. And it's nothing personal against police officers. This is not personal. This is political in terms of people's lives. Thank you.
Dr. King, thanks for that explanation. And, you know, I hear what you're saying about most of the crime you experience on your campus is they're crimes of poverty, yeah? If there was a violent incident like a shooter on campus, how would that be dealt with under this new model?
Yes, we would. If it's a real police situation, we would call the police. We're in Oakland. The Oakland police are there. They're not, 911. That would be possible, but that's not needed on a regular basis at all. But if we have an active shooter or something crazy like that, we would of course call someone that could handle that situation.
Thank you. I want to talk briefly about mental health. We've got a lot of questions about that in the chat. I know that UC Berkeley is experimenting with transitioning some mental health services away from police so that when there's a crisis response, when a student is in crisis, the person who shows up is a counselor rather than a police officer. Obviously, this whole question of defunding or transferring resources from policing to other functions is grounded in numbers. University of California campuses spent about $138 million on policing in the 2018-2019 fiscal year. And so we have people asking in the chat, can we transfer more of those resources to mental health care? And I'm wondering, Chair Perez, do you think that what's being tried at Berkeley could be a model potentially for other UC campuses?
I absolutely think it could be a model, and it ought to be the expectation that these are exactly the kind of instances where you don't need a police response, where you want an interventionist that actually has the appropriate training to deal with a person in crisis. But as I said to Naomi's question, our vision for how much we can grow mental health services shouldn't be limited by how much we shrink police funding. It needs to exceed that, as do so many of these other ideas. And when I look at the issues that Dylan raised with respect to access to affordable healthcare, access to affordable housing, to food insecurity, solutions for food insecurity, these are all issues that as Dylan knows, I've worked on and created huge pots of targeted funding for when I was in the legislature. These are my core values that are in alignment here, and the growth of these shouldn't be limited just to the savings we get in the reforms that we make in policing. Even if we were to eliminate policing altogether, it wouldn't pay for the totality of the costs that we talked about. And as Dr. King said, there are these instances that still do require a police response. Here's where I want to make a point. I feel adamantly about this, that I would much rather have a police response that's campus-based in the UC system, that's informed by the collaborative conversations that we're having, that's informed by the spirit of shared governance that you see, that creates the right sets of expectations and accountability, than being dependent on the LAPD or the Alameda County Sheriffs to respond in those crises. And I say that as somebody who's had interactions with the LAPD and the LA County Sheriffs over the years. So the direction is one question. But one should not control how far we can be visionary on the investment we make in all these other core issues that we talk about.
Thank you. We're seeing a pretty high level discussion happening at the UC at the system level, I guess I should say, between administrators and students on these issues it's kind of just starting to open up. We had the recent UC symposium, discussions at the Board of Regents. Jacori, I'm interested in hearing from you. It seems like maybe the discussion at Cal State is not quite happening yet at that level. I know yesterday Cal State Chancellor Joseph Castro released this statement in response to the Derek Chauvin verdict. He said, "I believe America is yearning for an inflection point, one that marks a turn toward healing, reconciliation, and recovery. The CSU can serve as that inflection point." Do you agree, Jacori, that maybe that the debate at the CSU hasn't yet reached the level that it's been happening within the UC? And I'm wondering, why you think that is, and if you think that we're going to see any change, particularly with the news we had this week with the verdict in the George Floyd case.
So yeah, and also before I also respond, I think in response to Chair Perez, I think also an issue too, because you were saying in terms of having LAPD, for instance, come onto campus. An issue is a lot of times these police officers are coming from city police departments who are getting hired by our campuses, who have a history of brutalization, who have quote unquote retired from being in LAPD or so, but still let me go to a college campus. And so that still is not getting rid of the issue of these police officers. And then also in terms of the response, given to the Chauvin trial, I think it's very foolish to think that this instance would be the groundbreaking change that we need for our system when the system itself is inherently corrupt and has been broken. And I think that it's very easy to have like a socially progressive mindset and be like, oh, well, since, you know, quote unquote, justice was delivered in this instance, it makes sense that these conversations are going to be furthered and continued. But what we continuously see is that, okay, yes, maybe this person was found guilty. But just with that, you know, Breonna Taylor still has not even gotten a case. Dante Wright was murdered the other week. And then it's just too much, you know, like to be like, oh, this one event is going to get that change that we need. What we really need is start focusing on the systems that are at play that are putting us in these situations in the first place. Justice would have been if George Floyd was never murdered in the first place, or if these people were never murdered in the first place, not like, oh, okay, we got one, you know, one cop was held accountable, but that does not address or, you know, give room to the millions, I mean, to the many other things that are occurring, not only on our campuses, but within our communities. And I think that, you know, as much as I'm glad that, you know, Derek Chauvin is guilty, that does not take away from the feelings that I still have as a Black person. I mean, like, that's great, but at the end of the day, like, these things are still continuously happening every day. And I think the reason why the Cal State system hasn't necessarily, you know, been able to advance is because speaking from student organizers, there's students across the state, across 23 Cal State campuses who are constantly fighting for abolition. SQE, even SQE members are here, and CFA. I've worked with them, put on events, worked with them. At this point, it's like the voice is there. We are just not being platformed and given the opportunity to express what we are feeling. It's even gotten to the point of advocating to our student association, California State Student Association. You know, that was a conversation in and of itself of Black voices not being centered, BIPOC voices not being uplifted and heard, to the point where we didn't even get to have anything accomplished because of like the bureaucracy of how these systems are working. And we are still in the same predicament that we were before George Floyd happened. And so that's very frustrating because I feel like it puts an image out that students are not caring or students are not doing anything. But the thing is, students are not giving the attention or the platform that they deserve to be able to advocate for these issues. Because if you really went onto these college campuses, you would see that there's a good amount of students who would rather call for the abolition of UPD than reform.
Thank you. I want to toss it to you, Naomi, to just hear your perspective too, whether you think we're at a turning point in terms of student advocacy around these issues. And then we'll move on to a few last audience questions before we wrap up.
I believe students are at necessarily a turning point, but students understand what's happening right now, right? And it's all just a matter of galvanizing that power. As far as like the large institutions, no, I don't believe it's necessarily a turning point. Because again, I know that Dr. Rodriguez had brought this up specifically, and I know that Chief Farrow lamented on it as well. However, the timing in which the SRT document was produced within the same week of the conclusion of the Chauvin trial, just kind of in general, right, doesn't quite bode well. It's politically conflictive. It's a politically conflicted reality. The UC's police department has been involved in numerous incidents of flagrant abuses of authority while publicly engaging conversations with students. This is something, and yes, definitely Micaiah Bryan as well. I apologize, I'm mispronouncing her name. But specifically, it's like you're saying one thing and doing another. Personally, and kind of more broadly, we haven't even reached the tip of what we're trying to do. There's so much more work to be done. And also, if any CSU folks, specifically from SQE, please contact me. And we definitely need to bridge this gap between the UC and the CSU, because we're essentially fighting for the same things. Certainly, the way in which UC PD and UPD are set to operate on their campuses are different. However, the horrors remain the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. I'm going to toss it back to Omar, who's going to ask a few questions that we've heard from the audience before we wrap up.
Absolutely. So we've got time for one question from the audience. This is from Joshua. What are the metrics being used to measure efficacy of UC police? And I want to, send this to Chief Farrow or Chair Perez. You've heard both Naomi and Jacori explain how even when police do respond, they're not doing so adequately, they're not doing so appropriately. And considering this criticism coming from students, coming widely from students, how are you able to measure efficacy when it's clear that students don't feel like police are appropriately, adequately responding to students?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the conversation. It's been most engaging. Two ways. One of the things that I think we look at most is how do we deploy our officers, and how do we respond, and how do we resolve things? And I think it's really important for us is that we are restorative justice minded. We are holistic minded. We practice in neighborhood court, mental health court, restorative justice courts, and that's how we try to approach everything that we do to try to keep our communities out of the criminal justice system, but be able to deal with things in a more holistic way. And that's the value system we put. And at the same time, too, and I think it's really important for the transparency part, that the mechanisms we use sometimes to figure out how well we do is that any complaints, any concerns, we have a fully operating police accountability board that is made up of students, undergraduate, graduate, staff, and faculty. There are no police on that who serve as the advisory board to the police department. And that all cases of alleged wrongdoing go through a compliance part, goes to the path for recommendations on sustainability or not sustainability. So what we're trying to do is be holistic, be transparent, and allow the community to inform us and really push us in directions that they want to go. And that's where we're trying to take UC Davis.
Chair Perez, would you like to jump in?
Look, I think the chief has the metrics for one campus. There's 9 others. I'm still waiting to hear from all of them in this discussion that we're leading up to before the regions start evaluating the options that come before us. I think, one of the things that I made very clear is that we have to look at every police engagement, not just use of force engagements, and really evaluate whether they're appropriate engagements, whether they were necessary engagements, and how we support police officers that are engaged in a constructive way, and how we hold accountable police officers who are engaged in ways that don't align with the values that we have as an institution. But I think a lot more of that discussion is going to be playing out as we take this from the conversation stage to debating what our policy should be, what our funding priorities should be, what our budgeting expression should be.
Got it. Thank you so much. I'll be sending that over back to Felicia now.
Thanks, Omar. So that's all the time we have for this event. And I want to thank our panelists so much for their time and their expertise. This is an issue that, folks understandably have strong emotions about, and it's an extremely urgent issue, which is why we wanted to hold this discussion tonight. So we appreciate the conversation and everybody's contributions. And for those of you who are out there in Zoom land or following on social media, thank you for spending some time with us, thinking through this important issue of campus policing. The CalMatters College Journalism Network will continue to cover the debate over campus policing in the months to come. You can send us story tips at cjn@calmatters.org or fill out the Google form that we're dropping in the chat now. And I will drop it if no one has yet. And thanks so much. You can also follow us on Twitter at CollegeBeatCA. Thanks to the folks at KQED for making this event possible, and to the College Futures Foundation, which supports our higher education reporting. Really appreciate everyone's presence here tonight.